Your speaker is Adair. He got his PhD in physics from Ohio State, except that unlike most physicists you're going to meet, his whole area of research is in education, namely in ancient education as it relates to Christianity, which is actually ridiculously cool because there aren't enough of those out there. He has a book, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View, which uses science to show how the Christmas story has been misunderstood over the years. And he blogs at gilgamesh42.wordpress.com. Ladies and gentlemen, Adair.
All right. So first off, thanks for coming to listen to me blabber for today. But before we get started to the actual talk, if you could indulge me a bit, I want to do actually a little bit of research. So I have a couple of quick physics questions. Don't worry, you don't have to worry about right or wrong answers. But first one I have here, this is supposed to be a case of a block sliding down at constant velocity on this nice smooth surface. Amongst these what we call free body diagrams, just showing all the different forces, which one of those do you think best represents this block sliding to the right at constant velocity?
E. A.
So E, I'm hearing A. Anyone for B?
C.
Okay, so a quick show of hands, let's go. How many say A? 3, 4, 5.
No.
Okay, how many going for B? About 4, looks like. How about C? D? 3, 4. And how about E?
No, I meant E. I'm sorry.
What did you have before?
I can't read. I said D. I meant E.
Okay. Okay, excellent. So just grabbing a little bit of info there. And one other question. This one's a little more qualitative. So imagine you're driving down the highway, high speed, and all of a sudden a deer jumps in front of your car. Panic, and you slam down the brakes. When that's happening, how do you feel? All right, so you feel panic, you still feel going forward. Do you feel like there's anything acting on you? Do you feel like anything's happening to you while you're slamming on the brakes? Still moving?
My pants.
All right. Do you feel like anything's happening to you, anything like acting on your body when you're hitting the brakes like that?
Yeah, I feel like I'm condensing.
Condensing? Okay, in what direction?
I feel like the back half of me is moving towards the front half of me.
Okay.
At a slower speed than the front half of me is moving.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Does anyone have a somewhat similar feeling? So, yes.
You almost get the same deer in the headlights back as the deer.
That's true, that's true.
The seatbelt is pulling you back.
Seatbelt pulling you back, okay. Anything also in the forward direction? Anyone notice anything like that? Like the seatbelt pushing you back, anything the other way?
You're continuing to move forward.
Okay. And you were kind of like jerking kind of forward. Do you feel like you're pushed that way, or? Okay. So just to be clear, does it sound like you were saying you felt pushed forward a bit?
No, not pushed.
Not pushed? Not pushed? Okay. All right. Excellent. So that's my research portion. So the actual talk I'm going to get into is basically what we know about reasoning, rationality, intuitions, and what this could mean about working and growing in your group, and also when it comes to discussing and debating with those who don't necessarily have the same worldview as you. And of course, we're a group that tries to prize reason and rationality and such, but sometimes in the case we find those on what we call the other side not so much. So this has probably been posted on Facebook many times, but this Pentecostal preacher who basically says, stop thinking, it'll just confuse you.
Get it.
Yeah, now of course, doesn't exactly sound too rational to us. And of course, this is probably somebody on the fringes, but here's a quote from a famous conservative religious leader that was given just several months ago. So a person saying about how we want to know everything about the world, how that's worldly, that's basically sinful, it leads us to confusion. Who do you think said this statement?
Jesus.
Much more recent than Jesus.
Oh, is it Sarah Palin?
I wouldn't consider her a religious leader, thank goodness.
Joel
The Pope.
Osteen or whatever his name is.
Robertson, Olstein, all good guesses, but Time Magazine's Person of the Year, Pope Francis.
Thanks for ruining the Pope.
So has some fairly disparaging things to say about curiosity about the world. And he's following a bit of a tradition because St. Augustine in his Confession says similar things about how curiosity about the world is ultimately not that good of a thing, and is ultimately a distraction from the stuff that's really important, like theology, real stuff. So I mean, very discouraging, this sort of, curiosity and free thinking and such. And, to some degree they have a point, because when we do the data collection, we actually find out that, less religious people, more secular people are just those sorts, that they tend to be more reflective of things, or tend to think things more deeply, we tend to be better at reasoning in the first place. We're better at doing logic and rationality, on average at least. Also, one thing that we're really big on is we kind of go out of our way to try to find ideas and see if they conflict with each other, and try to say this is conflicting and we need to fix that. Very often, of course, we talk about in religious context the mystery of faith and leave it at that. Many times when I went as a Roman Catholic, that came up every Mass. Of course, now I realize, oh boy, that's not what we want. Now, it should be the case that rationality isn't the whole story for how we get to atheism. Plenty of people go to atheism for non-rational reasons, or they just never pick up on religion. Some people, for example, don't have such a theory of mind that they are able to project minds outside of themselves, and so it's very hard to then think of the ultimate mind without a body that's supposed to be a god. So those, especially on like the autism spectrum, tend not to develop that and become theistic, at least more often. So, of course, this thing makes us think the solution then should just be, we just need to make people think better. If we make them more rational, we'll get ourselves some atheists. But few things that might make that a bit more difficult, and I want you to consider something from Plato's dialogue, the Meno, and what's known as the Meno's paradox. How many of you happen to have read this dialogue by chance? 2, 3, all right. All right, read more Plato. And it's not just for kids. Another pun for today. Okay, so the paradox that Meno is supposed to be presenting is this problem. Either you know something or you don't. Is that supposed to be the binary to it? If you know something, then you're not going to go research and find out if it's true. You already know it. And if you don't know it, then you wouldn't even be able to recognize it if you found it in the first place. So the argument then is that, or the paradox apparently is, it is basically impossible to do inquiry because you either know it or you'll never figure it out anyways. There are some points of how it was worded that's a little bit ill-formed, and it also is the case that really knowledge isn't completely binary. But it does give us, the intuition sense that basically the less you know about something, the harder it is to figure out if you're wrong and figuring out how to figure out what the right answer is. How would you even know you have the right answer if you're sufficiently ignorant enough? So these sorts of searches are difficult, even if you are a perfectly rational being. So want to consider, what does this mean for doing inquiry, and what does it mean for doing critical thinking, and what the science says on this sort of subject beyond just the philosophical reflections of Plato, whose solution to that was weird. So the thing is, when you actually want to successfully critically think about something, it's really contingent on your background knowledge of the subject matter. While we want to, give critical thinking skills that'll work in a broad variety of areas, it's still the case that our success in doing it is very context-based. The previous speaker, Shauna, gave us out these interesting quizzes, and if you look at those, there's probably one of those questions that you'll get wrong more likely than not. The other one you'll probably get more right than not. But structurally they're the same, but one of them is much more familiar context. And of course, when it comes to learning these things, you can't just go find it on Google and you're set. There's a few things. One, you first have to figure out there's something you don't know you need to look up. So you already have to be aware you're unaware of something. Second, you then need to know, where can I go and find it? Third, how do I know what I find is reliable? And of course, do I actually understand what it says? If I go and get a chemistry paper that was published in Nature, am I going to even be able to understand it? For me, probably not, because my chemistry knowledge is quite bad. I think my chemistry knowledge is now contingent on what I've seen on Breaking Bad. So, and the thing is though, also if you're going to try to go and look it up, you have the problem that you have, unfortunately, what we call finite working memory. You can only have a few thoughts in your head at any given time. So you go look up something, you're not sure about something, you go look up something else. By the time you come back to what you were originally at, you've already forgotten everything because you haven't put it into your long-term memory. And you just can't keep it all in there, and so you can't possibly think critically about it. That you basically already have to know it before you can really start critically examining it. And as in this reference I provide, that it seems that critical thinking is not a skill that we can really transfer from one context to another so effortlessly and completely. So, for example, in this case I think about what you need to do if you want to critically examine the causes of World War II. Would you will probably want to look at things like the effects of the Treaty of Versailles. Some would argue that it was Prussian military tradition that brought Germany to become a military superpower again in the 1930s and 40s. Which of these are plausible mechanisms? How much did the poverty of the effects of the Weimar Republic, or basically just how good a speaker was Hitler? What things are going to explain that? So think about all the things you would need to know to answer the questions of what caused World War II. What knowledge would you need? How would you examine that? And then think, what of those skills would you have in common with thinking about feminist critiques of media? How much of that would help you, say, think critically about a physics problem? It's not that great of a transfer. There's obviously the rationality to it, the logic to it, but to successfully think about it and to judge other arguments about it, you already need to know a lot about the subject and how you would even analyze the subject. It's also a big thing that experts in a subject matter think differently about the same thing than a novice does. A novice tends to look at surface features and group things by surface features, while experts have they see the underlying causes, the underlying structure to explain things. So they think about it fundamentally differently. So this, though, actually then leads in some ways to some of the strengths and weaknesses of the skeptic movement. And of course, we got TAM going on right now. And we know that the skeptics movement does a lot of good work. It helps us realize a lot of our fatal flaws, but it also does have some limitations. Now, things, of course, that they're really good at the skeptic talks is, reminding us about how some of our senses are going to drive us wrong. I mean, how often is Bigfoot explained by, just various problems with eyewitness reporting, or you don't know how DNA evidence works. One person apparently claiming that they had gotten hair of a feral human. Feral isn't a DNA thing, that's a cultural thing. So this person claimed he had the hair of a human that he killed. Obviously he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's just talking big, otherwise he's murdering people. So I mean, these are the sorts of things the skeptic movement is really good about, basically telling us what are the red flags about our, the evidence that we gather. Again, of course, giving us the great statement from Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But how do you know what's extraordinary and what would count as extraordinary evidence or claims? That's going to require background knowledge. Bigfoot might seem completely natural to you, and of course in some ways it kind of is. It's another primate that we just haven't seen. That doesn't seem too unusual. It's just that because of all the searching, it's become so unusual. So I want to provide a bit of an example of what you often see in the skeptics movement, that they'll provide these sorts of like baloney kits, detect things that are just, like pseudoscience or really bad. This was posted by James Randi about a month ago on Facebook, and also Facebook was being kind to me because it was providing me this advertisement to John Edwards. As we know, the biggest douchebag in the universe. So this was to a baloney detector kit by Dr. Amy Tuber of the Skeptical OB, and if you look at some of the points she has, it's not claiming to be comprehensive, but these are all good things to look at for red flags. But the thing is, though, none of these things actually induce critical thinking, and none of them are deep reflections on the subject. It's basically saying if you see this sort of thing, you should be wary. It's not telling you what it's wrong, why it's wrong, or what the right answer would even be. And of course, sometimes, these might actually be a bit wrong. For example, citing esoteric scientific theories. Well, sometimes an esoteric scientific theory is the reason something happens. I have a computer here. It ultimately works due to quantum mechanics. And that's a pretty complicated esoteric theory, so is semiconductor physics. But would I dismiss computer science because it refers to semiconductors? So even so, these flags aren't going to be perfect. Or the brilliant heretic, usually someone on the fringes will say, well, they said Galileo was wrong. Yeah, and of course he was right about some things, but though for wrong reasons historically. But of course someone else who says, well, I'm just like Galileo, well, probably not. Nonetheless, though, if you just go and dismiss someone because they're in the fringe, then you might be missing out on something that might be true. Those who've been following, say, for example, the Jesus historicity debate, there's attempts to make cogent arguments that is against the majority. Should we just dismiss it simply because it's the minority, even if they have the best arguments? You would have to actually critically examine these sorts of things, and so you can't just use this list, for example. And no matter what, the reason you know this list is right for the most part is, again, because of background knowledge. You know when somebody says toxins from your background knowledge, they don't know what they're talking about. I could also provide this Skeptical Baloney kit from Michael Shermer, this 10-point list, which is more comprehensive, and besides, of course, saying, you need to look at logical fallacies they might be making, but in particular points 4 and 6 here that I've put in italics, basically saying, does this fit with our background knowledge of the entire world? You don't know everything. So the only way you could use this list and actually be successful is already knowing a whole lot. So if you're, say, a high schooler and you may not know too much about chemistry, you may not know too much about homeopathy, then how would you critically examine it just by giving this list? You would have to do a lot of digging, and you probably would have to go at it for weeks or months until you could really critically examine it. You can't just go by surface features. So that's a bit of a limitation then of skeptical methodology, that it takes a whole lot of effort, a whole lot of scientific knowledge to really get at these things. So I want to highlight the point that if you want to successfully critically think, you need to know a lot. The best critical thinkers basically know a lot about a whole lot of different things. And you've probably seen plenty of examples where a scientist is absolutely brilliant in their field, they go to another one, and they completely muck it up. Because, again, they don't have that background knowledge, and yet they think they know what they're doing because they have a PhD. Now, my PhD is in knowing everything, so I'm set. And of course, also, there's still the aspect of doing things rationally, knowing and being aware of cognitive biases, but just telling them that, about a cognitive bias isn't usually sufficient. And being more rational doesn't mean you're going to avoid it. Plenty of studies that those who are more mentally sophisticated are just as prone to cognitive biases. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of conscious work, and if you just tell someone there's this cognitive bias, they're not likely to apply that to themselves very well. So we have to tell people, and we have to, of course, get into their minds and have them practice that. But of course, they're also going to need to know a lot. We got to get a lot of factual information out there for you to critically assess things well. So if we get the facts out, we can make things worse. So this is a graph actually of an example of what's called the backfire effect. This was back in 2005, where they were basically telling people about the truth of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Tell that to liberals in 2005, and they were more likely to believe the right answer. Tell that to conservatives, they were more likely to believe the wrong answer. Tell them that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, they are more likely to believe in weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now this was in 2005. When they did this study later, the backfire effect disappeared, in part, I guess, because everyone decided, yeah, that was kind of a mistake. But at least in 2005, this is how conservatives were acting, with a big backfire effect. And this is fairly consistent with a whole lot of other information from the political sciences and such, that people who are intelligent look for the evidence that fits for what they want to hear. Those who are more rational, more reasonable, who are better at math skills are more likely to actually diverge on what the right answer is given the exact same information. So the worst example I've seen is you give them a context of seeing how effective is some sort of skin cream at preventing rashes. People who are really good at looking at a 2x2 matrix table to tell them that are really good at answering the question correctly, do fine. You switch it to gun control, bam, they can't do math anymore. And if you just tell them, of course, about cognitive biases, what do they tend to do? Say, well, you're the one suffering from the bias, and so you're wrong, well, I'm right. So this happens all the time, and a big part of it is simply this identity protection, that what is meaningful to them, and that's what gets them stuck. So you can't just provide facts. It's not sufficient. And how do we really get around this? Right now, the science isn't really that clear on how to best get the information out there and have people actually accept it, especially if it's controversial. So obviously we can't just go on and say God doesn't exist. We know that doesn't just work. But let's consider one thing, though, what we know in the information from education theory. So a couple of the hot words that are usually used there are metacognition, basically thinking about your own thought processes, your own beliefs, actually thinking about why you believe what you do ultimately, and see, is that consistent with your other thoughts? And usually the go-to theory in a lot of education stuff is called constructivism, where your knowledge is built on your previous experiences, your previous knowledge, what you've been told before, and you're building up your own personal knowledge structures. And to build that up, usually an instructor is going to use what's called scaffolding. Just like with scaffolding of a building, you're setting it up, you're providing some sort of structure to help students in the right direction, give them some guidance, so they're not just going through all possible logical possibilities to get to their answer. And also, one word here that actually is a bit contentious in literature is misconception, so I'm careful to point that out and how I'm defining it, as these are beliefs that are both not true, they both go against what you're trying to teach them, and that belief also interferes with that being taught. So when you're trying to teach someone, when you're trying to actually do this education process, you need to be aware of what they previously believed, so that way you can help them learn new things. And also you need to know what things they believe are wrong, and then try to approach a way of trying to get around that, trying to actually help them realize the errors of that misconception. So what can we try to do as rationalists in our own groups and actually grow our own groups and become more and more reasonable? One of the things I would like to suggest that we could do is basically book clubs, or some sort of group activity where we go out, we try to read something in a variety of different areas. Best to do is, in your groups, you probably have people with talents in the arts, you probably have people with talents in mathematics, in a huge variety of areas, but have them use their own expertise to say, let's read this book, basically as a group. Everyone gets access to that, everyone reads that, and then comes together and then discusses the literature. The person who's most knowledgeable should try to probably lead the discussion, so that way they can provide the necessary scaffolding and direction to any sort of group discussions. And you probably want to be more emphasizing using good methodology with these sorts of things rather than just getting to the right answer. And so good practice of rationality and also learning more along the way. This will help us know more, and it'll help us think about it better. And what should you read? I say everything. All the subjects of academia, and even some fiction, or at least good fiction. Recently, for example, I read John Green's Fault in Our Stars. That could be a good discussion book because of how do you empathize with people that are teenagers and suffering cancer and falling in love and trying to see their heroes and all these sorts of things. So you want good literature rather than the latest zombie apocalypse book, depending on which. World War Z maybe. But I mean, there's all sorts of different dimensions. How does this character make you feel? How do you relate that to your own feelings and your own sense of loss? And of course, as literary theory, having a good English major telling me what's good and bad about this book, that's what I'd like to know. And so you want to read a lot, and then you want to integrate this with what you know, your own experiences. You want to put it all together. So to give an example from what we were doing earlier with this physics question, so I asked you guys what you had, and there was a bit of spread everywhere, but to provide a little bit of prompting, if I was to remind you of these two things which aren't showing up well. The definition of acceleration, which is change in velocity over the change in time, and that the net force on a body is equal to its mass times its acceleration. So given these definition points, does this change any of your answers?
Yes.
All right, what would you like to answer now?
D.
D. So there's no force at all acting on the box?
Well, no, net force.
True, but this free body diagram is supposed to show all the forces acting in the box.
Oh, then E.
E. Okay, problem is though, there isn't any friction force backwards.
There is air resistance.
This is this is completely air resistanceless.
Oh, then it's
I
B.
changed my B to B because I
B?
forgot it was frictionless.
But the thing is though, here there is a net force.
But there's no acceleration.
No acceleration is the thing, because it's constant velocity.
Oh.
Constant velocity.
And the reason I'm highlighting this is because this is a common misconception of what's called the force of motion. That you believe that there's supposed to be a force in the way. Sorry? You have your hand up?
Yes, I think it really depends on where and how this block is positioned. Is this block on Earth? Is this block in outer space?
We're assuming a real world context.
Okay, so,
No Martian blocks.
okay.
Assume standard conditions when you
Yeah.
say otherwise.
Right. So the reason I'm highlighting this is because this is a common misconception that we see all the time in physics education. And when I highlight these points, it helps you realize, okay, it tries to activate what knowledge you might have had if you've taken physics in high school or college, and try to remember that and fight against the intuition you've built up over the last 18, 20, 30 years of your life. And this is an extremely common thing. And the reason I also wanted to highlight it, thank you, is how you might want to use this knowledge for discussing people who basically believe religion on intuition. So this force of motion intuition, extremely common. Even those who have taken college physics, half of them will still believe in this false theory of motion that's basically medieval in form, what's often called like the impetus theory. And so even if even if you come to my class, even if I teach you for a semester, you'll leave and you'll probably still think about this force of motion as the real thing, at least intuitively, unless I tell you, remember, Newton said something about this. And it took a really long time to finally get over this. It really blocked basically 2,000 years of scientific advance, because this hypothesis has one problem. It basically kills the heliocentric theory of motion. If the Earth is going around the sun and there's supposed to be a force of motion, shouldn't you be feeling a titanic force as you go around the sun at tens of thousands of miles per hour? I don't feel moving. And that was basically the sort of intuition that blocked a lot of the development of astronomical theories that we now know are correct because of this intuition. But the feelings you have, those are real. It's just that how we've basically made our mental models. And that sounds somewhat similar to the intuitions of the religious that they'll describe as the burning of the bosom, as the Mormons put it, the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit, as philosopher Bill Craig puts it. Or Augustine talks about the true source of joy. So these sorts of intuitions, these sorts of feelings, they interpret as God. And this is believed by lots and lots of people. These feelings are nearly universal, and they get in the way of a lot of science. I mean, obviously, it gets in the way of people who don't want to believe in evolution. Those who basically want to deny the mind-brain connection, all sorts of things. Now, the feelings are real, but how they're interpreted is the thing that's weird. So if you can say, well, here's this common misconception that people have that feels really real to you. Again, stop in your car, brake, you feel you might be pushed forward. But you're not really pushed forward. That's just your forward velocity, which isn't a force. It feels like you're being pushed, but it's not real. If you can misinterpret that, and you know that's going to stop science, couldn't it also be the same thing here? So I'd like you to try out and see if this actually works as a debate strategy for those who believe on intuition or just feel the burning in the bosom sort of thing. So that's my talk, and if you want a little bit of my research, there's some of the sources I used along the way. Thank you.
Do you have a copy of your slides anywhere?
I will. I believe the slides will also be put up with the talk on the Lanyard site, so I'll be able to get a copy to you, and if need be, you can email me and I'll send it to you directly. Because I'm sure you don't want to memorize that. Yes?
I just wonder if you could talk for a second about the impact of rapport and modeling good updating, maybe telling stories about changes of mind that we've experienced as a technique to kind of go in through the back door and sort of use social psychology to get past some of these intuitive blocks?
Yes, that's one of the things that a constructivist would very much want to point out. Yeah, use those previous knowledge, those stories, and stories we're kind of like cognitively biased towards really liking narratives. So yeah, using a good story to get people to attach and realize where their thinking or their intuition might be going wrong is extremely helpful. I would also try to use if I was to give a whole history of science lecture, I would basically talk about Galileo and Newton, because they originally had those same intuitions of physics as everyone else did, but finally overcame them, even though partially, like for example in the Principia of Newton, he actually screwed up using his own third law to explain planetary motion, because he was still halfway between the new right stuff and the old-timey stuff. So stories, always good.
Cool, thank you.